Landlord from hell, my 3-year nightmare in Los Angeles ends in glorious karma. Alright, Reddit. Buckle up, because I've got a story that could be ripped straight out of a legal drama. For 3 miserable years, I lived in an apartment that was falling apart, managed by a landlord who seemed like a walking, talking Craigslist scam. Let's call him Mr. Slumlord. When I moved into this place in Los Angeles, I thought I'd finally found something manageable in a city where rent can make your eyes water. Little did I know, I was signing up for the most frustrating, stressful, and downright surreal chapter of my life. The beginning, a crappy apartment and a crappier landlord. When I moved in, I had modest expectations. It wasn't like I thought I was moving into a high-rise condo or anything. The apartment was old, sure, but it was also reasonably priced, and that's all that really mattered to me at the time. The location wasn't too bad either, just close enough to the action of the city without being smack dab in the chaos. It was the kind of place you'd call charming if you were being generous, or a dump if you were being honest. At first, I noticed a few small issues. The porch creaked ominously every time I stepped on it, the gas heater looked like it might burst into flames at any second, and there were a couple of mysterious leaks that seemed to come and go without explanation. But hey, I thought, that's just part of living in an older building, right? I was naive. I didn't realize these weren't just quirks of the property, they were warning signs. Warning signs that Mr. Slumlord was the kind of landlord who didn't give a damn about anything but squeezing every last dollar out of his tenants. Things start to go south. It didn't take long for things to start falling apart, literally and figuratively. One day, I came home to do laundry only to discover that my dryer was gone. At first, I thought it had been stolen. I mean, it's LA, stranger things have happened. But no, the truth was even more absurd. My landlord had taken it. When I confronted him about it, he didn't even try to deny it. I needed it for another unit, he said casually, like borrowing, stealing my appliances was just a normal part of being a landlord. That was the first major incident, but it was far from the last. The plumbing in the apartment was a disaster. Pipes would clog and burst constantly, and when a particularly bad leak flooded my bathroom, I called him in a panic. His response? "You must be overusing the sink." Overusing the sink? Who even says that? When I refused to pay for the repairs, he simply deducted the cost from my security deposit, as if that were perfectly normal. The retaliation begins. By the end of my first year, I was already over it. But finding a new place in LA is no easy feat, so I stayed put, hoping things might improve. Spoiler, they didn't. In fact, they got worse. Much worse. When I finally involved a lawyer over a ridiculous parking dispute, he tried charging me an extra $150 a month for the spot I'd been using since I moved in. He retaliated hard. First, he started sending me threatening letters, full of legal jargon that didn't even make sense. Then, he began showing up unannounced. He'd lurk around the property, staring at me or my neighbors, making everyone uncomfortable. It was like living in a horror movie where the villain wasn't a ghost or a masked killer, but a bitter old man with nothing better to do. One day, I came home to find him trying to pick the lock on my apartment. Yes, trying to break in. His excuse? He thought he'd heard water running. I didn't buy it for a second, but what could I do? At that point, I felt trapped, like I was living under the thumb of a tyrant who could do whatever he wanted without consequences. The apartment itself was a disaster. Let's talk about the apartment, shall we? If the landlord was bad, the building wasn't much better. The porch was a death trap, rotting and unstable, with planks that creaked and groaned like they were begging to collapse. I avoided it as much as possible, but every now and then, I'd have to step out there, and each time, it felt like playing Russian roulette with my safety. The gas heater was another nightmare. It was ancient, and every time I turned it on, it made this terrifying clicking noise, like it was gearing up to explode. I lived in constant fear that I'd wake up one morning to find my apartment engulfed in flames. And then there was the ceiling. Oh, the ceiling. Chunks of paint and plaster would fall randomly, sometimes landing on furniture, sometimes on me. It got to the point where I started wearing a hat indoors, just in case. The final straw. By the time my third year rolled around, I was done. Done with the harassment, done with the neglect, done with the entire situation. When Mr. Slumlord announced he was raising my rent by $500 a month, I knew it was time to go. But I wasn't about to leave quietly. For days before my lease ended, I called the city's building inspector. I'd been keeping a mental list of violations for years, and now it was time to unleash it. The inspector came the next day, clipboard in hand, ready to document everything. The porch was the first thing he noticed. "This isn't just unsafe, it's a lawsuit waiting to happen," he said, shaking his head. From there, we went through the laundry list of problems: the illegal plumbing, the fire hazard heater, the peeling ceiling. Every violation carried a $500 per day fine until it was fixed. Watching him write it all down was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. The grand finale. But of course, Mr. Slumlord couldn't let me leave without one final act of insanity. On my moving day, while I was out at my storage unit, he broke into my apartment and nailed the door shut. Yes, nailed it shut. When I came back and saw what he'd done, I was equal parts furious and amazed at his audacity. I called the police immediately. They showed up within minutes. And when I explained everything, their jaws dropped. "This isn't just harassment," one officer said. "This is a felony." They took my statement and filed a report, and before long, Mr. Slumlord was facing charges for breaking and entering. The aftermath, driving away from that building for the last time, was a moment of pure liberation. For 3 years, I'd felt trapped, like I was at the mercy of a man who had no regard for anyone but himself. But now, the tables had turned. Between the city fines and the felony charges, his reign of terror was finally coming to an end. I don't know what happened to him after I left, but I like to imagine him sweating bullets every time he sees a cop car or a letter from the city. So, Reddit, what's your landlord horror story? Let's commiserate. I can't be the only one who's dealt with this kind of madness. The fallout, what happened after I left? Even after I left that hellhole, I couldn't resist keeping tabs on what was happening with Mr. Slumlord. I mean, how could I not? This was the man who tormented me for 3 years, and now the universe was finally serving him a cold plate of karma. I stayed in touch with a few of my old neighbors who were still living in the building, and they were more than happy to keep me in the loop. Apparently, after the building inspector's visit, things started spiraling for him. The fines were no joke. $500 a day per violation adds up fast, especially when you've got a laundry list of problems like he did. The porch alone was costing him thousands of dollars a week because he didn't have the money or the will to fix it properly. My neighbors told me that he tried to do the bare minimum to get the city off his back, but it wasn't enough. The inspector came back for a follow-up and slapped him with even more fines for failing to meet the safety standards. The tenants' revolt. Word of the fines spread through the building like wildfire, and suddenly, all the other tenants started speaking up. For years, people had been afraid to push back against him. He had a way of making everyone feel small and powerless. But when they saw that he was finally being held accountable, it lit a fire under them. One by one, tenants started filing complaints with the city. Broken appliances, leaky pipes, faulty wiring, you name it, they reported it. The building inspector started making regular visits, and every time he showed up, it seemed like he found something new to fine him for. One neighbor told me that Mr. Slumlord was practically living at City Hall, trying to argue his way out of the violations. Spoiler, it didn't work. The legal drama. Meanwhile, the felony charge for breaking and entering was moving forward. I wasn't sure if it would actually stick. After all, this is LA, where people with money and connections can often wriggle out of trouble. But, as it turns out, Mr. Slumlord didn't have either. The police were taking the case seriously, especially after I provided them with the security camera footage of him lurking around my apartment. That footage, combined with the fact that he literally nailed my door shut, made it pretty clear that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was deliberate harassment. He tried to argue that he was protecting his property or some nonsense like that, but the evidence was damning. The DA decided to move forward with the case, and the last I heard, he was facing serious legal consequences. The building's future. As for the building itself, well, it didn't fare much better than its owner. The city eventually deemed the porch unsafe for use, and tenants were forced to stop using it altogether until it could be rebuilt properly. That process dragged on for months because Mr. Slumlord refused to pay for a licensed contractor. He kept trying to hire cheap labor to patch things up, but the city wasn't having it. The tenants who remained banded together and started pushing for rent reductions, citing all the ongoing safety issues and the fact that they couldn't use parts of the property. A few of them even threatened to sue him, which sent him into full-blown panic mode. One of my neighbors told me that he started showing up at the building less and less, probably because he couldn't handle the constant complaints and legal pressure. Eventually, word got out that he was trying to sell the property. I'm not sure if he ever managed to offload it, but I like to think that whoever bought it had to spend a fortune fixing all the problems he ignored for years. What I learned, looking back, those 3 years were some of the most stressful of my life. Living under Mr. Slumlord's reign was like being stuck in a never-ending game of cat and mouse. Every time I thought I'd gotten ahead, by fixing a problem myself or standing up to him, he'd find a new way to retaliate. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that persistence pays off. Document everything. Know your rights. And don't be afraid to fight back, even if it feels like an uphill battle. People like Mr. Slumlord thrive on intimidation, but once you start pushing back, their power starts to crumble. Moving on. Now, I'm in a much better place, literally and figuratively. My new apartment is far from perfect, but it's clean, safe, and managed by someone who actually cares about their tenants. The peace of mind I've gained is priceless. I can finally sleep without worrying about someone trying to break into my apartment or whether the ceiling is going to cave in on me. Every now and then, I think about driving past my old building, just to see what it looks like now. Part of me hopes it's been renovated and turned into something decent, but another part of me hopes it's still a crumbling mess, a fitting tribute to the man who let it fall apart. So, Reddit, that's my story. 3 years of hell, followed by a glorious dose of karma. If you've ever dealt with a landlord like Mr. Slumlord, you have my sympathy. And if you're currently dealing with one, let this story be a reminder, you can fight back, and sometimes, you even win. Now, tell me, what's your landlord horror story? I know I can't be the only one who's lived through this kind of madness. Let's hear it.